Defense industry. The EU defense industry. Consolidation without an army. The, how Europe is building military power without saying so. Introduction. The army that dare not speak its name. Europe has spent most of the post Cold War era pretending that history was over. Borders were stable, war was distant, and security could be outsourced comfortably and cheaply to the United States. For nearly 3 decades, this illusion held. NATO expanded, defense budgets shrank, and European armies quietly transformed from instruments of war into symbols of political reassurance. That era is over. Russian annexation of Crimea, the grinding war in Ukraine, the shock of Donald Trump's presidency, and the slow realization that American strategic attention is pivoting towards Asia have forced Europe to confront a reality it long avoided. Security cannot be subcontracted forever. Yet, the continent remains deeply divided over what strategic autonomy actually means and how far it should go. Nowhere is this contradiction more visible than in Europe's defense industry. Fragmented, nationally siloed, inefficient, and chronically underscaled. Europe's defense sector reflects the political front lines of the Union itself, and yet, paradoxically, it is through this very industry rather than through treaties or flags that Europe may be inching towards something resembling a collective military capacity, not an EU army, but something that begins to function like one. The original sin, fragmentation by design. Unlike the United States, which built its military industrial complex around a single federal authority, Europe inherited a defense ecosystem shaped by sovereign pride. Each nation preserved its champions, its own doctrines, its own procurement logic. The French built Rafales, the Swedish built Gripens, Germany built Leopards, Italy built Frems, often to meet overlapping requirements at vastly higher costs. Their number tells the story. Europe fields more than a dozen types of main battle tanks, multiple fighter aircraft platforms, parallel naval designs, incompatible communications and logistics systems. The result is not diversity, it's strategic inefficiency. Research and development costs are duplicated, production runs are short, export competitiveness suffers, and in crisis, interoperability becomes an improvisation rather than a baseline capacity. For years, this inefficiency was tolerated. The US security umbrella allowed Europe to enjoy the benefits of peace without paying the full cost of preparedness. Defense became a budgetary afterthought, a political liability rather than a strategic priority. That tolerance has vanished. When an EU army was never Why an EU army was never the real plan. Calls for a formal EU army have surfaced repeatedly over the decades, from the failed European defense community of the 1950s to a more recent rhetorical flourishes by European leaders. Every time they have founded on the same obstacle, sovereignty. Defense remains the last red line of the nation state. Command authority, intelligence control, and the right to deploy force are not technical issues, they are existential ones. In an era of populist nationalism, any attempt to centralize military power in Brussels would almost certainly provoke political lashbacks severe enough to collapse the project entirely. European leaders understand that the lesson of Brexit, of stalled constitutional reforms, and of rising Euro skepticism is clear. Integration by decree no longer works, so strategy changed. Instead of building an army, Europe began dismantling the barriers that prevent armies from working together. The shift to indirect power, integration without ownership, the European Defence Fund, money as architecture. The European Defence Fund's EDF represents a quiet but profound shift in how Europe approaches security. Rather than commanding outcomes, Brussels conditions incentives. By restricting fund eligibility to multinational projects, the EDF nudges national governments towards cooperations without forcing it. This sum involves a sum of 13 billion euros between 2021 and 2027 are modest compared to US defense spending, but the political signal is unmistakable. The logic is structured. Shared R&D creates shared standards creates international lock-in. Industrial lock-in constrains political future political choices. Once supply chain platforms and maintenance ecosystems are integrated, disintegration becomes costly. Autonomy gives way not to coercion but to dependency. PESCO, binding commitments without a centralized command. Permanent Structure Cooperation (PESCO) operates on a similar principle. It doesn't replace national militaries, nor does it impose a unified chain of command. Instead, it binds participating states to capability development commitments, interoperability, targets, and operational readiness standards. Its genius lies in what it avoids. No EU general staff, no compulsory deployments, no supranational command authority. Yet, over time, PESCO projects force national militaries to plan, train, and invest together. The more they do so, the harder it becomes to act alone. This integration, this is integration by habit. Germany's framework nation concept, hierarchy without empire. Germany's framework nation concept, FNC, pushes the logic further. By encouraging smaller states to specialize and plug into the capabilities of larger military, it introduces a functional hierarchy into European defense. These efficiency gains are obvious. Not every country needs a full spectrum force. Specialization reduces duplication and increases operational depth. But the political implications are far more subtle and more consequential. Specialization creates asymmetry, asymmetry creates dependence, and dependence creates leadership, whether declared or not. France's hesitation towards the FNC is telling. Paris understands that in a system where Germany provides the backbone, influence follows capacity. This is not clash of ideology, but of strategic gravity. Industry as the silent integrator. If political integration is fragile, industrial integration is resilient. Joint fighter programs, shared tank platforms, naval mergers, and submarine collaborations are not merely cost saving exercises. They are capability convergence mechanisms. When nation buys the same equipment, train on the same systems, rely on the same maintenance infrastructure, operation alignment flows naturally. Doctrine adapts to hardware, strategy adapts to doctrine. Politics adapts last. This is how military power has consolidated not through declarations but through logistics. The shadow of NATO and the United States. None of this occurs in a vacuum. NATO remains the cornerstone of European defense, and the United States remain its indispensable actor. European initiatives are careful, about almost obsessive. In their instance, that EU defense efforts are complementary rather than competitive. Yet the underlying motivation is clear: insurance. Insurance against US political volatility, strategic and retrenchment, diverging threat perceptions. Europe is not preparing to leave NATO, it is preparing for a future in which NATO may no longer guarantee the same level of American commitment. What Europe is actually building, not an EU army, but a shared industrial base, interoperable forces, harmonized standards, integrated logistics, and habitual cooperation. In other words, the functional prerequisite of collective military power without the symbolism that would trigger political revolt. Conclusion: power by accumulation, not proclamation. European defense integration is not revolutionary, it is evolutionary. It advances not through speeches or treaties, but through the procurement rules, finding incentives, and industrial gravity. Is not the birth of a European army. This is the construction of a system that behaves like one when required. History suggests that when systems reach a certain level of functional integration, political reality eventually follows. Whether Europe ever chooses to name what it's building remains uncertain. What clear is Europe is no longer content to remain strategically naked, and it has found a way to dress itself quietly, incrementally, and without asking permission from its own fears.